Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with Attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hi, welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with Attorney Benjamin England. And I'm Kendall Trusky, your host. Hi, Benjamin. How are you today?
Doing great. Very good to see you. Happy to be able to come and talk about FDA and customs issues.
Looking forward to learning a lot about it. So to start, can you give us a brief overview of the types of products that fall under FDA regulation when it comes to imports?
Sure. So FDA is a federal agency that regulates at least 40% of the GDP. So that's all foods of all kinds, except agricultural commodities like beef, pork, eggs. The U.S. Department of Agriculture regulates those products. So setting aside the USDA ag products, FDA regulates all the other food, which is a large swath of economy. It's the Food and Drug Administration, so clearly foods and drugs. They enforce the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it's foods, drugs, cosmetics, right? Those are sort of obvious right in the statute. FDA also regulates medical devices of all kinds. Biological products. They regulate whether they're therapeutic biologics, like some of the very popular GLP medications that are out now are biological drugs, and FDA regulates those. But FDA also regulates some sort of true biologics like blood, plasma, and serum. So they regulate blood as well. FDA regulates dietary supplements. They regulate tobacco now. They regulate e-cigarettes as a tobacco product. FDA regulates electronic radiation emitting equipment. So that's sort of a big word for anything that generates radiation that's ionizing that could have harm to the body. So ultrasound, X-ray, microwave is all regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So you can see it starts to mount up, right? When you take a flight at the airport, and you go through the magnetometer or you go through that device that determines if you're safe, FDA regulates that device, even though it's not a medical device. Now, of course, they also regulate it when it's used in medical settings as well. They regulate MRI, CT scans, et cetera, not just because they're medical devices, but also because they emit electronic radiation, ionizing radiation, which can cause harm. So that's FDA's jurisdiction. And so FDA regulates that jurisdiction in its manufacturing, in the distribution, in the marketing, everything related to the raw materials going into it, the components going into those products, wherever that happens for products coming to the U.S. So if they're manufactured here, then FDA regulates them here as domestic facilities, domestic manufacturers. If they're manufactured in any of the many other countries, then FDA regulates the manufacturing operations in the other countries and does foreign inspections. And as well as when the goods come here, they have to cross the border. And when they cross the border, then FDA and customs work together to regulate that imported product. But anything, you walk into a grocery store, you walk into a hospital, you walk into a pharmacy, and FDA regulates probably 98% of what's in those buildings.
Benjamin, why is it important for importers to pay attention to FDA regulations when bringing goods into the U.S.? And what can go wrong if they don't?
There's a lot of talk about the fact there's less manufacturing in the United States. And that's an economic question, right? That matters. It matters to the economy. It matters to the cost of goods. Buy American is more than just a slogan. When it comes to the Food and Drug Administration, Buy American means in many sense, and I'm not sort of spouting that in particular, but Buy American essentially would mean buying products that are made here in the United States, which means the Food and Drug Administration has the ability to inspect the facilities very, very easily because they're just down the road, right? As opposed to products that are manufactured in another country. FDA does do foreign inspections, but they're not very frequent. And so the result is that the agency performs a lot of their sort of regulatory activity at the border. And then to the extent they can, after a product has come into the market through inspections of the importer or later distributors of the goods. It's harder for the government to regulate at the border. And the statute is designed to make it easier for them to do so. So, for instance, if I manufacture something in the United States and I sell it to somebody else in the United States, anywhere, and there's a problem with it, the FDA can always come in and do an inspection. If the FDA wants to stop my product or they want to seize it or they want to administratively detain it, you're not allowed to go somewhere, then the government has to do certain things that require it to give notice to me, give me an opportunity for a hearing. It might be for an administrative law judge or even a court. Right. And so the standards are relatively high and it's harder for the government to do that. At the border, the burden of proof and the restrictions on the government are much lower. And you think of it this way, right? When you yourself come into the United States, you're subject to search. Everything that you bring in is subject to search. Like what I like to say is the Fourth Amendment doesn't cross the border, period, right? So if you're coming in, the Fourth Amendment's not going to protect you. It's also true that when you're importing FDA-regulated goods, the FDA has the ability to keep product out of the market based upon a very, very small amount of evidence. They don't have to have a lot of evidence to stop cargo. And that's how they use they'll use that power to further investigate and to require the importer to prove that the goods are in compliance with the law. So it's important to make sure you make sure they're in compliance with the law, because it doesn't take much for FDA to stop the cargo. And once it's stopped, then you're going to have to produce the documentation, demonstrate to the agency that it's okay for it to come in, it complies with all the requirements, et cetera. So, and you can't do that on the fly when the goods have been hit at the border, right? You're going to have to be ready for that, because you'll have timeframes too. They're going to require you to, the government expects you to respond within a certain time frame. So it's extremely important on the import side, because the burden of proof on the government is so low. It doesn't require a lot from, in fact, in the statute, it says that that the FDA can refuse admission to products that they regulate at the border based upon the appearance of a violation, right? They don't have to prove a violation exists. They just have to have evidence that they can point to and say, that product appears to be in violation of the law, and that can stop the cargo, right? So It's a very, very low burden of proof. And so that's why it's so important for importers to know what they're doing. And it's not just compliance, but also how they communicate with the government is critical, because you can easily say something that you don't realize the government is interpreting differently than what you mean for it to mean. And then they find the appearance, they stop the cargo, and now you're spending time trying to get the cargo released.
That makes sense too. Cautious of what you say. At that point, is it best for a business or an importer to reach out to your firm to step in when it comes to importing goods? Why is early intervention a key?
Well, so first of all, I'm an attorney, and I also have a consulting practice, FDAImports.com, and I represent companies before the government all the time, every single day. I deal with FDA and customs and people who work for me. There's not a day that goes by. I emailed 20 different people in the government last night on a couple of cases, and different ports around the country on a couple of issues. And so we're doing it all the time. Now, so we're used to it, right? Importers are not as used to or as comfortable dealing with the government. And so that's one reason why you might want to get somebody to speak for you. Customs brokers, right? There's a whole group of people in the import industry that are called customs brokers. They're licensed to transact business with customs on behalf of another person. So that's complicated, right? It's like a CPA and the IRS, right? So when you file your taxes, if you hire a CPA, you have the option of having the CPA file it for you, right? And so it's similar. A customs broker will file for you the information that customs requires when you import goods. You hire the broker to do that. And they're in that business and they're licensed to do that. Now, those people interact with the government all the time too. And a lot of times they'll answer the kinds of questions that we would answer, but they're answering them sort of the routine ones, right? It's when they become less routine that usually the brokers will say, you need to go hire an attorney. The other thing is, if you've got an imported cargo, I mean, all imported cargo is important to you, but some of them are some imported cargo is really important to you. Like if it doesn't get through, your business could fail, right? That'd be another reason why just because of the value of the goods, right? It could be your entire, all your revenue is hanging on the sale of the goods that are in the container. Maybe right now it's Christmas time, right? What's coming in? Goods that are going into retail for Christmas. By now they should already be on the shelves. But some of them are not. Some of them are hung up at the FDA. And so that's those containers, if we don't get them released, cosmetics, food, novelty foods, candy, what's after Christmas? Valentine's Day. Okay, well, what chocolate, candies, and what's FDA do? They start testing for filth. They test for colors that are illegal. They test for salmonella and chocolate. So the government is also like seasonal in that respect. So if you don't get somebody in early, when you have that kind of a critical shipment, you could find yourself weeks down the road not making progress and not getting the cargo. The other thing is it can be complex. The FDA's question can seem simple, but what they're asking for actually can be more complex than you expect. So you don't want to necessarily. There's time. My opinion is always the same when it comes to the government. I tell them as little as I possibly have to, right? As little as I can, because I know that whenever I tell them anything, it has to be the truth. So I don't want to say something, if I don't have to tell the government something, I don't tell them, just because it's just going to a lot of times leads to other questions. So knowing what you can say and what you can avoid saying is just as important as knowing what the requirements are. And that kind of discussion at the border with the government, you have to manage that properly when you're talking about the importation of goods that could mean your business if you don't get them through.
Yeah, if you're waiting on those goods to make a sale and you don't have the proper communication with them, I can see where that can happen. And
I have many different sort of examples of that. I gave the example of product coming in for Christmas, and this happens every year. I mean, I'm getting phone calls usually with somebody's hair on fire every Friday in October and November up until about the middle of December. Now, by the time you're at the middle of December, you have to be pretty close to having gotten most of your goods in, or you're not going to make the shelves anyway. But by then you're talking about Valentine's Day commodities, right? Products coming from by December, Valentine's material is coming in. But even let's set the season aside. Just make it about pharmaceuticals. I have done work for lots of pharmaceutical companies that import product. Most drugs are not made here. They're made in other countries. Or the active pharmaceutical ingredients that are used to manufacture the drug, like the actual drug component itself. When you buy a pill, whether it's over the counter or a prescription, it's so big, right? Well, that's not all drug, right? The drug is how many milligrams of that. And so the active ingredient very often is manufactured in another country and it's imported here and finished, or the finished drug is. And it doesn't matter whether it's generic, over the counter, or prescription, or branded pharmaceuticals. That's true. And I've had many circumstances where pharmaceutical companies have told me that all of their containers of a particular drug product are locked up at the border. They're not able to get them in. I have to figure out what's going on, and I have to get that information, to the government.
Never thought about that. Well, let me ask you this. What can importers expect from FDA and customs when importing FDA-regulated products? Is there anything they can expect?
Sure. So I mentioned about the role that a customs broker plays in order to transmit government information to the government. The government is going to screen that data, and they're going to make a decision whether or not the information that has been received is enough to stop the cargo. Remember, it's a very low standard. The appearance standard is a very low standard. The government only needs to find the appearance of a violation to stop it. So they don't need a lot of data. And sometimes the information that's transmitted is enough for the government to say, stop, we want to get more details. Other times, the system just releases it anyway. It could be that the system releases it, everything seems to be fine, they have no reason to examine it. Other times, they may want to examine the cargo. They might want to sample it and test it, depending upon what it is. Some commodities, some products are more prone to being tested than others, and they are the consumables, right? So foods, dietary supplements, cosmetic products, over-the-counter drugs, those are more likely to be tested than things like prescription drugs that are subject to a new drug approval, medical devices, biological products. It's unlikely that FDA will sample those at the border. Instead, they're relying on the manufacturing processes and the FDA approval process to guarantee the safety. But so when one thing you can expect is the government is going to at some frequency examine your cargo, and they're going to test it. If you have a problem, if FDA finds a problem, they're going to give you a notice of that problem. They're going to tell you what the problem is. It might be a problem based upon it appears to be contaminated. It could be that there have been some prior shipments where you've made claims you're not supposed to make, and so they're checking this one, and they want you to prove that you've got yourself in line, and so you'll get a notice. When you get that notice, you have the opportunity to respond to that notice. It's not a judicial or administrative judicial hearing. It's what's called a quasi-administrative hearing. It's regulatory in nature, so it's not like a court. But the rule, but evidence plays a part. The government has to have evidence to charge the product, and you have to have evidence to overcome the charge. And you have the opportunity to present that evidence during what's called the hearing stage, which is the period during which the shipment is being detained by the FDA. And they give you notice, and then you have a chance to respond. If you can overcome the problem and satisfy the FDA, the goods get released and they come into the market. If not, you might have to do something to the product in order to get it into the market. You may have to relabel it. You may have to process it further. An example would be if someone brings in fish, raw material, raw fish, and it's tested and FDA finds a problem, you might have to cook it, right? If they find salmonella, you cook it, it kills the salmonella. And now you're selling a cooked seafood rather than a raw stage.
Interesting.
Right? Otherwise, you might have to relabel it. If you can't satisfy FDA, then FDA is going to refuse the cargo. If they refuse it, then they turn to customs, and customs make sure that you either export it or you destroy it within 90 days. So you have the examination process, you have the data process, the examination process, you have the sampling maybe and testing, and then you could have this hearing process that's going on with the government, and then the outcomes, which might be refusal. Usually it's release because usually the product is fine.
Okay, very, very interesting stuff. What exactly are the primary steps importers need to take before importing FDA-regulated products into the U.S.?
So you need to make certain, obviously, you have to make sure that you know what your product is. I actually talked about this, I think, in another time. What is the product? Is it in compliance? Do you have the right labels? If you need pre-approvals, do you have the pre-approvals? Documenting all of that, key step. When you ship product from another country to the United States, or someone is shipping to you, they're going to also send you commercial documents, or else you can't ship. You're going to have a commercial invoice. You're going to have a packing list. You're going to have a bill of lading or an airway bill, and these are all commercial documents that require no matter what you're shipping. You can be shipping ball bearings or toys from Temu, right? It doesn't really matter. Whatever's coming in, it's going to have an invoice. It's going to have a packing list. It's going to have an airway bill or a bill of lading. In FDA-regulated goods, you also might have certificates of analyses. You might have test results. You could have some certifications from a third party showing that your product is safe. You have to make sure you have all the documents that are in order. And the other key is to make sure that your documents are all telling a consistent story as to what the product is and what its regulatory status is, so that when the government looks at it, they don't see something in the third page that's like, that's weird. What's that doing in there? And next thing you know, now they're examining the cargo and asking questions about it. So what is it? Is it in compliance? Have you documented the compliance pieces correctly? And are your commercial documents correct? The next thing is making certain your customs broker, you need to know what your tariff codes are for customs. Tariff codes are the codes that customs uses to determine what duty is going to be, how much you're going to pay in tax when you bring it in. So customs compliance is completely additional to the FDA compliance. You have to make certain you comply with customs requirements, and brokers will help you with that also. So, those would be probably the key steps. If you have to have some pre-approval, then you need to get that before you bring it in. You see that with pharmaceuticals. You see that with medical devices many times, although not always. A lot of medical devices don't require pre-approval. Understanding the requirements and making sure that you meet them is key.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, let me ask you this, Benjamin. When a business imports FDA-regulated products, obviously customs officials often play a role. How does the FDA collaborate with U.S. Customs and Border Protection to ensure compliance, and what role does each agency play in the process?
No, it's actually sort of how do these two partners work together, which is a really good key between the FDA and Customs. The way I like to say it is that the FDA has the authority, the jurisdiction to determine what is supposed to come into the country. That's their authority, what's allowed in. And it tends to be very health related, science related, technologically related, in terms of the technology of the product, medical devices, electronic products that emit radiation, right? Very, 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 very technical. Customs Border Protection. Customs used to be a treasury agency, and their primary function was to collect money. It was Customs used to be a part of the Department of Treasury, so it was a revenue generating agency. Now, Customs and Border Protection is mostly about prevention of weapons of mass destruction, protecting the homeland, because now it's an agency of the Department of Homeland Security. It's no longer in Treasury. So Customs is mostly worried about things like narcotics, gun smuggling, human trafficking, intellectual property violations, smuggling, failing to declare goods that are coming in for whatever reason, counterfeits, etc. Right? There's lots of different kinds of things that Customs usually is thinking about. And then FDA finds a problem, and then they tell Customs about it. So Customs sort of comes in with the stick. I like to think of it as the FDA is like the scientist with the lab coat walking around and pointing at things, and then the guy behind him is the Customs officer who comes in with a stick and sort of whacks you, and then they turn around and go off looking for drugs again, right? So that's sort of like a very sort of cartoony way to think about it. But the two agencies and their systems are actually very, very integrated. FDA gets all of its electronic data from the Customs system. So the brokers transmit it to Customs, and then Customs transmits it to FDA. So whenever you declare something to the FDA, you're declaring it to Customs sort of automatically. So if you fail to declare something correctly, if you lie or you get something wrong, it's a Customs violation also, right? It's not just an FDA violation. And so Customs is very interested in, and they work very closely with the FDA. I mentioned the refusal process, right? If FDA refuses cargo, then Customs enforces the export or destruction of those goods, the refused goods. Customs also has seizure authority that's much easier to work with than FDA's seizure authority. Customs seizes goods at the border all the time. So FDA might ask Customs to seize something for them while they are enforcing some FDA requirement. So they'll work together in that way too. But generally, FDA is going to ask Customs to do things, and if Customs has the time, they're going to do it, unless it's a it's a safety issue, and then they're almost always going to do it. And then they'll always take care of ensure that the refused product is getting out of the country.
That was a good visual too. Very good visual. Yeah. Let me ask you one more thing. For businesses that want to ensure smooth and efficient importation of FDA-regulated products, what are the top 3 things they should focus on to reduce risk and stay compliant? So
I would say the top 3 things that anybody in the FDA-regulated space needs to worry about is going to be the safety of the product.
Okay.
That's the first one, right? And safety of a product is really sort of dependent upon what the product is. Medicines, for instance, pharmaceuticals, are really sort of regulated poison, if you think about it, right? I mean, that's because that's why there's a risk of overdose. If you take too much of a drug, it can have a serious effect, and it could be lethal. So technically, right, medicines are really products that have certain therapeutic benefit unless they are abused one way or another. And so consequently, so that safety question is a different question than the seafood that I'm buying at the local seafood market, or that is being imported from another country, through Tampa and being shipped up to Baltimore, right? The safety question is different. So I think that understanding what is necessary to ensure your product is safe is probably the most important thing, because that's what the FDA is first looking for is safety. Okay. The next thing then is going to be all of the regulatory requirements that the government has established, product by product, that's intended primarily to ensure that the product is safe, right? So one thing is you have to understand what safety is in terms of risk, and then you understand what safety is in terms of the government's mind with the regulatory requirements. Now you're thinking about the things and the regulation, right? And then the third thing is going to be whether or not you are being truthful and honest with respect to the marketing and the labeling of the product. Like those are probably the 3 things. And if you think about it, it's not really different than anything else, right? It just happens to be that foods are like, you remember, for instance, the big concern, the meaningful concern about lead paint in toys. Okay, well, so what's the question? Safety, right? The degree to which lead-based paints can produce problems for children who might be, chewing on it or playing, putting it in their mouth. So safety, that's a safety. Well, then what regulatory requirements exist in order to ensure that doesn't happen? Well, the Consumer Product Safety Commission has regulations, right? And then, okay, well then how about labeling? Don't allow your child to put this in their mouth. Not for children under the age of 4, right? It's really not different. Now, the requirements are different, right? The level and degree of regulatory structure is different between a prescription drug pharmaceutical, a medical device that's like implanted in your body to keep you alive, compared to a toothpick, which FDA regulates, right? But the questions are different, just the regulatory requirements might change.
Okay, that's good to know. Good to know. Well, how can a business reach out to you or your team for further guidance on navigating FDA import regulations? Can you share that with us real quick?
Sure, absolutely. I own FDAImports.com, LLC. It's a consulting practice. I like to say, if you can't find me, you're not looking for me. I'm all over the internet. FDAImports.com has been a very, very well-established website for almost 20 years. Lots of people know who I am in the market. So if you ask for a referral, a lot of times it'll come to me. So you can go to FDAImports.com. You can send something through the contact page there, or you can email me at contact@FDAImports.com. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me. And that'll go through a couple different people. It goes to more than just me. You don't want it just coming to me because I have too many emails coming to me. But that's the best way to reach out.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Benjamin England. We've been listening to FDA Imports with Benjamin England, and thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.